Hi, in today's video I'm going to talk about cassette players. What we have here is a cassette player out of an IM or IM4006, and we also have a cassette player that's out of an IM5006. Yesterday I was working and rebuilding a customer's IM5006 that he sent in to me, and the repair is almost complete and it's time to reassemble the set, but one of the problems with it was the cassette player doesn't play correctly, so we need to look at why and then repair it. So I thought I'd do a brief comparison between the two, because these are the two most common modern cassette players that NuTone has made. There's probably more of these than there are of all of the earlier and previous models that they ever made, and but they are substantially different. Some of the differences between the two are the cassette player in the 4006 is primarily constructed of plastic, and it's primarily a mechanical device, whereas the cassette player in a 5006 is made primarily of metal or steel. It does have nylon and plastic gears in it, but the body of the unit and most of the mechanism is made out of metal. And also the 5006 cassette player is, while it is a mechanical device, of course, it's not controlled by mechanical buttons and levers and rods and things like that. It's an electronically controlled cassette player, and we'll talk more about that in a second. But let's first look at the 4006 cassette player. And even though the 4006 cassette player is primarily a mechanical device, it does have attached to the back of it, this is a preamp input and output board and motor control power supply board to run the motor. So let's go ahead and take that off and get it out of the way, because of course there are always some electronics in every cassette player. Now we're down to primarily the mechanical bits. We do have an electric motor here. This is a 12-volt DC motor. It runs counterclockwise. Cassette player motors can be clockwise or counterclockwise, and it drives a pulley that's down inside here, and then there are the two belts that drive the rest of it. And here's a good example of what happens. This is a cassette player I just pulled off the shelf to use as an example, and there's a bit of the belt that remains. And what happens to these are, let me find something to put this on. These are made out of some kind of synthetic material, and if you watch here you can see how if I take the screwdriver and go like this, how it's just smearing across the paper. Well, this is what happens to old cassette belts. They deteriorate to the point that they turn into this black tarry goo, and of course the cassette player won't work at this point because the belts have basically dissolved into this, which is a real mess. And lots of times this gets all over the inside of the mechanical workings of the cassette player, specifically in the pulleys, which you can see here. This pulley right here, so here's a piece of the belt, and if we grab that and pull on it, if we can not smash it, this one we got a little lucky on. See how it just fell apart there? This is always a real mess. That one we got pretty lucky on because it did peel out for the most part. But lots of times what happens is the belts dissolve to the point that they won't peel out of the groove in the pulley, and when you pull out the remnants you have this coating of the black tarry stuff all over inside the groove, and of course that has to be cleaned out before you put new belts on, otherwise it won't work properly. Anyway, that's just an aside about old belts. So the cassette player in a 4006 is primarily plastic. There are some metal bits, the bracket that the motor is attached to, and this plate on the back here, but if you took these off and disassembled it, almost everything inside is made out of plastic. And while that probably makes it somewhat less expensive to manufacture, it does mean that they have a tendency to break. The other thing that's different about this than the cassette player in the 5006 is this has mechanical operation. These are the keys that operate the controls of the cassette player. We call them keys, other people call them buttons. you have stop and eject, pause, fast forward, rewind, play, and record. And these, when you operate them, they move levers here, which move other levers there, which makes things happen on the inside. And these are all subject to wear, and the nylon gets old and brittle, and lots of times these are coated or filled up with all kinds of like sheetrock dust and things from being installed in the wall, and it interferes with how things operate, and they need to be taken apart and cleaned and lubricated and brought back to working condition again. Another real common problem, which I covered in another video, is the latch that holds the door closed can become broken because people pry the doors open, and all of those sort of things. So this is sort of a self-contained design. If we put the control board back on the back of it, I can plug it into a regulated DC power supply and lash on some individual wires, and I could actually make it work on its own outside the 4006. It's really like a sub-assembly of the whole thing. That's not really how it works in a 5006. So in a 5006, which is this is out of, it's a completely different type of design. There are no, it's sort of a bare bones design by comparison. The door that the cassette tape fits into is part of the faceplate assembly. There are no buttons or keys on the bottom. You still have your basic cassette movement, which is your take up, and actually they would be dual take up reels, and I'll explain why in a second. You have a mechanism here that when you energize it, and I don't know if I can do this by hand or not, this is the play head here. When it's put into play mode, this rises up. There seems to be something that there's a latch. So I'd have to look at how that works exactly. But this slides up against the tape. And if we look at the back side, you can see we still have pulleys and belts. It has one long belt here that goes around this pulley, around the top of the second pulley, around the little pulley on the motor. And then there's a smaller pulley here with a small belt here. This is also a 12-volt DC motor. However, it is a different motor than the one that's in the 4006 cassette deck, so they're not really interchangeable. And then you don't see, there is no motor control, preamp, output, input board, or anything like that on this. There is this little small circuit board here, and if I were to take this off, all you'll see is on the other side, there's a connector that this cable plugs into, and this is really sort of an interface board. It has traces on it, and it's soldered to different switches and things that's part of the cassette deck mechanism, and this is controlled by another board in the 5006. So in this custom, and another thing about the 5006 cassette player is a standard cassette player in a 4006 is a one-direction cassette player. You put a tape in, you press play. When it reaches the end of the tape, it shuts off automatically, or at least it's supposed to. And then you have to open the door, flip the tape over, and then press play again, and you play one side at a time. The 5006 cassette deck is an auto-reverse cassette deck, which means that when you play side A and it reaches the end, it will automatically turn the head around, and then the tape will run in the opposite direction and play side B. So you don't have to take the tape out to switch it around. All of that is controlled by the microcontroller in the 5006. The other thing you have in this, which is different than other designs, are these little tabs here. There's one here, here, and here. And if we were to take a cassette tape, these are sensing switches. So if we take a cassette tape and we pop it in, which you can do even if it's not in the set, like this, the body of the cassette tape pushes up on the sensing switches. For those of you who are not very cassette tape familiar, on the top of cassette tapes there's a little tab here and a little tab here, and as long as these are intact, you can play and record on this cassette. If you record something on it and you don't want it to become accidentally erased, you would break these tabs out and then you can play it, but you no longer can record on it. This is all very old school. For those of you who are probably under 30, you've never had a cassette player. Anyway, so when you put the tape in the player, like this sensing switch sees if there's a tab here, and this sensing switch sees if there's a tab here. If there's tabs in place, you can play and record. If the tabs are broken out, you can only play. And the reason that there are two is if the tape is traveling in this direction, this one counts because this is the A side, and when it reverses and it plays in the other direction, this one is for the B side. So you have to have two of those. The third switch right here is simply a switch that tells the microcontroller that controls the cassette deck that there is indeed a cassette tape in the deck. Without this, it won't operate. So that's what that's all about. So the problem with this particular one was that it would only play in one direction. It would play on the A side, it would travel this way and it would play correctly, but it wouldn't auto reverse, and we need to look at what's wrong with it and figure out why. An interesting part of this is, let me zoom in a little bit. This is the cassette head assembly, and right now it's in the A position, and when it switches, so things that people don't know about cassette tapes or don't know anymore. So here's the tape inside the cassette housing, and altogether it's a little more than 1/4 inch wide, and this is actually a 2-track tape. So if you were to divide it in half long ways, one half is the A side and the other half is the B side. So you have, it's all recorded on the same side, but it's split into two halves. When you go to play the tape, the head, which is this little dark gray swath right here, that's the magnetic coil that reads the tape. It's either biased towards, right now it's towards the back side of the cassette tape, but when it changes direction it has to read the other side. So what happens is there's a mechanism in here, and when it's energized you can watch it flip around. And that's how it achieves playing one half of the tape or the other half of the tape. So let me get the microcontroller board and show you what that's all about, and then we'll figure out what's wrong with this. This is the microcontroller board, or the main controller board, out of an IM5006, and it's a two-sided board, and what we have on here, you can sort of break it up into different segments. All of this up here has to do with the selective call intercom features of a 5006. Down here you have door speaker input circuitry, chime module input circuitry, also the circuitry for a remotely mounted electronic chime, which is connected to these two terminals. There's the door talk relay and some other miscellaneous door speaker communication stuff going on down here. If we flip it over to this side, we have two microcontrollers on the board. We have one here and one here. This is the one that's used for the intercom functions, and this one here is the one that controls the cassette deck. And on the face of a 5006 you have your standard cassette control buttons. You have stop and pause and play and rewind and record, and a button to change the directions. And the way this operates is, unlike on the 4006 cassette player, which, if you recall, you push a switch, you're moving a mechanical lever that's allowing other mechanical bits to activate or deactivate or unblock something so it can spin or something like that. The way this works is when someone goes up to their 5006 and pushes the play button, you're sending a signal to the microcontroller that says, hey, I want to play the cassette deck. the microcontroller looks up in its instructions or firmware, how do I do that? And then it sends out the appropriate signals and data to other supporting chips, which then make a mechanical action happen on the cassette deck. So it's sort of like Cassette Player by remote control. You're not actually pushing mechanical bits to make things happen. It's all being done electronically. Fortunately, it seems to be a pretty reliable design because from a control aspect, we don't really have a lot of problems with cassette decks in 5006s. Usually it's some type of mechanical problem. So let me get another one and we'll compare and see if we can figure out what's wrong with this one. Here are our two IM5006 cassette decks. This is the one out of the customer's unit, and this is one that belongs to the shop. And if we look at them, in fact, what we should do is flip the head around so they're both in the same direction. There we go. Now we're playing the same side on each one. If we start to look at the things that could be wrong with it, I see right off the bat what the problem is. You probably haven't yet. So if you think about it, in some sense, they're mirror images of each other if you divide it down the middle. And what you have here is this would be a take-up reel. This would also be a take-up reel if it's going in the other direction. You have the head assembly in the center, which is a common part regardless of which direction you're playing in. You have spindles here. These are shafts that are driven by pulleys or gears on the back of the unit that help their transport to transport the tape. Contrary to what a lot of people think, this isn't the primary transport. It's actually done here, but to make this work effectively, you have to have this. This is a little rubber wheel. It's referred to or called a pinch roller, and when the cassette player is activated and the mechanism in the center slides up to push the head against the cassette tape itself, the whole assembly goes up. These are pushed up also, and you can see that they're spring-loaded, and they push against the spinning rod, and the cassette tape is in the center here. It's in between the two pieces, and that's what helps make it transport. So here, this side seems to be okay, but if we look at this side, the pinch roller is missing. It's fallen out. So that's going to be a problem because the tape won't run in that direction because there's nothing here to help move the tape through the cassette deck. You can see on this side there is a pinch roller in place, so that's good. Another thing that I've seen happen to these, because these models are getting kind of old nowadays, is the pinch roller. It's made out of a sort of a rubbery material. It's pliable and flexible, and I've seen on older sets the rubbery material dries out and it gets hard, and it actually will develop cracks in it. And in those cases, sometimes it will not work at all, and sometimes it'll work at irregular speeds as it revolves around through the broken slits and the cracks, and it just doesn't work right. If you search around, there are places online that you can buy replacement pinch rollers. Of course, it's the kind of thing that there's probably 100,000 different kinds and sizes, and you have to consider the diameter of the little spindle in the middle of it because it has to be the right diameter, it has to be the right length, it has to fit in the little notches here that hold it in place. So it's a complicated thing. It's easier if you have a donor deck that you can rob parts out of. So let's go ahead and take this one out, and we're going to do a pinch roller ectomy, and then we're going to do a pinch roller transplant, and we're going to put it in here. Alright, so fortunately I don't think this is going to be too hard to do. I think the easiest way to do this will be just use a really small bladed flat screwdriver, and you very carefully put it between the pivoting housing and the pinch roller itself, and it popped right out. Oops. Not dropping it is probably, wait, where did it go? There it is. Focus. Anyway, there's the pinch roller. It's a good idea when these are out. They do tend to get a buildup that where the coating on the cassette tape transfers to the roller itself, and the easiest way to clean these is with a little bit of alcohol. So we'll use an alcohol swab or pad. You can buy these at your local drugstore, and all you really have to do is wipe the surface off, and you can see how dirty they are. This is sort of part of cassette player maintenance. I remember back in the 80s and 90s, 80s and 90s, before CDs and when CDs were too expensive for common people to own, say back when I was in high school, and you would go down to the music store and you could buy cassette head and pinch roller cleaning cassettes. So they were like this, only they didn't have tape in it. They had little felt pads, and they had gears that connected the pads to arms, and when you put it in your cassette player and you press play, the gears made the pads wiggle back and forth, and on the head and on the pinch rollers, and it would come with a solution which was probably mostly alcohol, and you would dampen the pads with the solution and put it in your cassette player and run it for a minute or two, and it would clean off the heads and the pinch rollers, and that was just standard maintenance. I remember driving around in high school. I used to keep a case full of cassette tapes under the passenger seat with all of my favorite songs. Alright, so we've cleaned the pinch roller, and we're going to put it back in the customer's unit. So let's go ahead and do it this way. So it's going to sit right in here, and I think all we have to do is sort of pop it in place. Oops. The hardest part about this is not dropping it sometimes. Alright, so now it's in place, and we'll just take our screwdriver and push it down, and it snapped in on both sides. Now we have a pinch roller in place. I won't be able to test this until I get the customer's unit all put back together, but I'm pretty sure that it will probably work. So that's sort of the ins and outs of an overview of cassette tape players in general, and specifically about the ones in 5006s. I hope you found this interesting and helpful. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. A thumbs up on YouTube. If you find our other videos helpful, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's all for today. See you on the next video.